Hello and welcome back to CHY4U, History of the West and the World at Discovery Academy. My name is Arseny Krchiver, and we're continuing with our introduction to the course and exploring in this lesson what Europe looked like as a place, as a society on the eve of modernity, so right before our course begins. So we're going to take a look at some definitions. We're going to look at Christianity, feudalism, what society in Europe was like, literature and art, a little bit of that, technology and how it was beginning to evolve in different ways, and two dramatic events that shaped European history and, in fact, changed the world history. Okay. Before we proceed further, you need to download and read the sections from the textbook Medieval Worlds: An Introduction to European History. You can find it on the class wiki. Read the sections carefully and answer the questions here. Okay, once you answer these questions, please proceed on with the lecture. Okay, so let's take a look. First of all, Christianity. If you traveled back to Middle Ages and you came up to an average person and you asked them, "Who are you as a person?" They wouldn't tell you that I'm French, I'm German, I'm English, the way they might today. In fact, the most common answer you probably would have received was, "I'm a Christian." Uh, and in many countries in Europe, the word Christian was also synonymous with a person or a farmer, for example. Christianity was the dominant force in Europe during most of the period we're going to be looking at, and certainly the dominant force in Europe since 6th century AD, Common Era, sorry. Christianity is one of the oldest monotheistic religions in the world. That means monotheistic means it only has one God. It was a dominant religion of Europe for nearly 2,000 years and continues to be the dominant religion in Europe even today. And it was split after 10th century Common Era. It was split into the Roman Catholic Church, which was the Western branch of Christianity, and Eastern Orthodox Church and its own branches, which is the Eastern Christian Church. And these two Christian churches, despite both believing in Christ, using the Bible, and so on, became more and more divergent, more and more different, and even today there's still major differences between the two. Most of the West, the what we understand by Western Europe today, was dominated by the Western branch, the Roman Catholic Church, while most of the Eastern Europe was dominated by the Eastern Orthodox Church. As far as the Roman Catholic Church is concerned, the most important person, the most important institution of the Roman Catholic Church was the institution of papacy. It comes from the title of the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, which is the Pope. The Pope was and still is the head of the Roman Catholic Church. During the Middle Ages, he was the most powerful person in Europe. Over here you can see the Pope's crest. According to the Bible, the first Pope, or at least the first Bishop of Rome, was given the keys to heaven by Jesus himself. Uh, and the reason why the Pope was the most important, most powerful person in Europe during the period, during Middle Ages, as well as the time period we're going to be looking at next, was for really two reasons. One was a spiritual reason, the other was political. The spiritual reason was that the Pope was the head of the church, and the church dogma, so the official word of the church, was that the Pope is literally God's representative on earth. Whatever the Pope says, it is as if God is speaking through him, which meant that he was clearly the spiritual, the moral authority in Europe. The second reason was because the Pope had the power to crown kings. In other words, he would be the one to actually crown the king or give permission for a king to be crowned. But he could also excommunicate them. In fact, he could excommunicate anyone. Excommunicate anyone. Excommunication meant you were kicked out of the church. And that meant that life could become a lot more dangerous and difficult for you as a result, because everyone around you would still be faithful Christian, but not you, not anymore. So you would become a pariah. A third reason, to go along with the political reason, was that the church was also the wealthiest and the largest landholder in Europe. And as we'll see shortly, land in this time period equaled wealth. The person who had the most land, the best land, was the wealthiest person. And the church, by uh, through donations from people, became the wealthiest and the largest landholder in Europe, which meant that the Pope had a lot of economic power as well, and the church as an institution. The church also played a very important cultural and political role in the West at this time, and not all of it was negative. The church dictated many of the laws and customs, and in fact, even today, many of the laws here in Canada or in the United States, they are implicitly based on Christian laws, on uh, the teachings in the Bible. So it was the uh, it was the moral authority. It was also a legal authority in many ways. Customs. The church was really the unifying cultural force in Europe. As I've said before, if you traveled to Europe and you asked a person who they were, they would identify themselves first as a Christian, and only then would they identify themselves as being from this city or that village, or speaking English or French or any other of hundreds of languages that Europe had at the time. The other reason why church was quite significant in Europe is that it collected a tithe from everyone. And the tithe was about 1/10 of everything produced. And you could pay by money. You could basically give some of what you produce to the church, for example, food. You could gift some land to the church. So there were different ways in which the church collected its due. So what did the church do with that money? Well, some of it, unfortunately, could be embezzled, and it could be used for corruption. So not all money ended up helping people. But the church was also a very powerful force, very powerful positive force in Europe as well. The church was the only place where you could get education. The church was among the few places that helped women who were divorced or widowed. The church was often the only way for poor people to give a good future to their kids. So you could give your child to the church, and that would ensure that they would be cared for, and in fact, eventually they might join the church themselves and become powerful figures in their own right. It wasn't entirely positive. Sorry, before we move on to some of the negative parts, actually, one more important thing about the importance of the church in Europe at the time was that the church ironically acted as a preserver of culture. Despite the fact that ancient Romans and ancient Greeks were not Christian, the Roman Catholic Church collected Roman and Greek artifacts, culture, and language. The official language of the Catholic Church was and still is Latin, but most members of the church could also at least read and write Greek. The church preserved Greek and Roman books, poetry, philosophical essays, uh, and in that way, the church actually preserved the past and enabled uh, human progress to continue, rather than for all that culture to be destroyed. But the negative side of the force was that of the church was that the church as an institution was also intolerant of other religions. uh, or intolerant of people who were still Christian but were disagreeing with the way the church was organized and ran. So heretics, heresy, in other words. And in this way, the church was also a negative force as well. But nonetheless, through good or ill, the church preserved culture. It provided some education to at least a limited number of people, but it also created a single European identity, the identity of a Christian, and it's going to have big implications for the future. Another important institution in Europe was that of feudalism, and the feudalism was a way of organizing society and politics. And in fact, historians today do not believe that feudalism really worked the way we think it did. So it might have been organized a little bit differently. It might not have been a system that's quite as simple as we think it was. But there is something, but there is something to it. We do know that at least in a number of European countries for several centuries, this kind of a political economic system was in place. It was a system whereby people would have obligations to those above them, whether it's paying taxes or uh, fighting in a war or other ways of, uh, of providing service. Uh, but in return, they expected their people above them to protect them. So, for example, lords would give land to knights, and the knights would be responsible for working this land, so they would be supervising the peasants, actually farming the land. And in return, if the lord needs the knight to show up for war, the knight has to come and fight in a war. It was a it was a very hierarchical structure, which means that power flows downward. In a democratic society, power flows upward. We, the people, have the voice, have the power of the vote. We vote for our representatives, and they are responsible to us. In this system, it was the other way around. The king, the king was appointed to protect and handle territory, but over time, kings became hereditary. So over time, you were born to be a king. But the king can't do everything by himself. He can't be everywhere at once, so the king would appoint lords. They would protect the king. They would also uh, keep justice in a certain province, for example. They will organize things. And when the king wants to go to war, the lords have to show up. Well, where do the lords get the soldiers? Well, as I said, the lords would appoint knights who would work the land, who would supervise the peasants, and in return, the knights collect might collect taxes, although there were also tax collectors. The knights would show up and they would fight in these wars. It was a rigid system, and it was a class system where there were classes of people, and typically you were born into a class, and there were not a lot of ways in which you could improve who you were in life, because you were usually born into a position. A serf was a kind of a peasant who was not free to move around. He wasn't quite a slave, but he wasn't far from it. He or she could marry whoever they wanted. They could own property, but they did not own the land which they farmed. Freemen were peasants or workers who could move around. They had certain freedoms. Um, they still had to pay taxes, however. Knights and lords, as I've said, they were either appointed or would more often be hereditary positions as well. My father was a knight, so I'm going to be a knight. So you didn't exactly have a lot of choice. Monks and priests were their own class, so those who prayed on the behalf of everyone else. And at the top, you would have the monarchs, kings, queens, emperors. Who you were in life was mostly determined by birth. And this system was quite stable for several centuries. And the reasons it was effective, was stable for quite a long time, was because, first of all, the church was supporting the system. So it was telling people this is how the world works, this is how God organized the world, and as long as there was enough land. But as populations rise, there become more and more pressure on the system to change, and there will also be a number of important events that will begin transforming European society from this to something different. Next lecture, we're going to take a look at uh, the way technology, culture, art, trade evolved in Europe at this time.